illustrative example 2 has the same information as illustrative example 1 that we did previously. So it's Tasteful, Textile, Pty Limited. So in illustrative example 1, we did the quantity statement to calculate the equivalent units. Now in illustrative example 2, if we look at the required, they ask us to prepare the production cost statements. So that's the average cost per unit. That's where we calculate the average cost per unit. And the allocation statement. So that's where we allocate the costs to closing work in process and completed units or finished goods. So it's basically where we value the inventory. So there's 3 stages to the process costing system. We have the quantity statement. So the first one is to calculate equivalent units. So that's what we did in illustrative example 1 and the information that we have here. So equivalent units. Then we calculate cost per unit. And we allocate in the third step, we allocate it to the types of inventory. So we're just going to do the second and the third stage. So if you look at the solution here, we already have the equivalent units, and this was calculated in illustrative example 1. So if you're unsure how to do this, make sure that you go over that example again to completely understand how we get the equivalent units. So we're first going to do first in, first out method. So just something to highlight here. Remember, we ignore the opening work in process that has been done in the previous period. So I think opening work in process was 60% complete. So anything up until that point has already been done in the previous period. So we only include all the work that still needs to be done. And that's only the 40% conversion costs because all the material has already been included in the previous period. So we don't include any material. So that's just something important to highlight for the first in, first out method. So in the production cost statement, so I'm just going to give the heading there, production cost statement. So this is where we decide which costs to include in our cost per unit calculation. So we have opening work in process costs that were given. That's our 95 for material and 80 for conversion costs. So the total would be 175,000. So 175. And then we have our current period costs. And that was the rest, so that's 3.58 million. So this is the total for material and conversion costs. And now we need to calculate the cost per unit. And we need to calculate it for material and for conversion costs separately because the units differ, the equivalent units differ. So then we have to decide, so remember cost per unit is a simple calculation of cost divided by a certain amount of units. So whatever units we use below, we have to use the corresponding cost above the line. And the units that we include are equivalent units and they exclude opening work in process. So that's important. For first in, first out method, we exclude opening work in process. So we need to exclude opening work in process from our costs as well above the line. So we'll only take our current period costs into account. So the current period cost for material, that was 1.55 million. And for conversion costs, that was 2.03 million. So that's the costs above the line, and then we can divide it by the equivalent units. So 500,000 for material, which will give us R3.10 per unit. And then for conversion costs, it's the current period cost divided by the current equivalent units, or the equivalent units taking into account current work that was done, 484,000. So that gives us 419 per unit. So this is the cost per unit for first in, first out method. Next, we need to allocate these to our different types of inventory, our finished goods and our closing work in process. So that would be in our allocation statement. So when we look at finished goods, what is included in finished goods? So the best way is to think of a T account. So work in process starts off with an opening balance. So that's our opening work in process. Then we add our current period costs to it. So opening work in process was the 175 and the current period cost is the 3.58 million. And then we complete some units. And that goes to finished goods, and that's what we need to value now. It's our finished goods. And then whatever is left would be our closing balance, which would be our closing work in process, which will also value here. So we are looking for these two, the outputs, the finished goods and the closing work in process. And the costs would come from opening work in process and the costs that were added in the current period. So finished goods, the first part of it, because we're using the first in, first out method, we have to include our opening work in process, and it was not included in the cost per unit. Why not? Because in our equivalent units, we didn't include opening work in process. We excluded it there. So in our cost per unit calculation, we also excluded the opening work in process costs. So we still have to add it. If we don't add it now in the allocation statement, it's not going to be added to our finished goods and to our closing balance of work in process. So we just simply add the cost that was given. For first in, first out, you always have to remember to add the opening work in process. And the cost of that would usually, it has to be given somewhere in the question. Next, we have to add the current period costs. So current period costs that were incurred. So for material and conversion costs, we'll do it separately. So material first. So I'll do the calculation in brackets. It's always good to show all your calculations to get your marks if you make a small mistake somewhere. So for material, how many units did we complete? So completed and transferred is 460,000 units. And the cost per unit for material is 310. So that equates to 1.426 million. And then we'll do the same for conversion costs. So how many equivalent units did we complete for conversion costs? So that would be the 472,000. So it's slightly more. So it's the same completed units, but we add the 40% of work that still needs to be done. If we look at this diagram, that 40% that still needs to be done for opening work in process, we add that, and then our cost per unit is 419 for conversion costs. So that adds up to, or equates to 1979669. So now we have our opening work in process, all our current period costs. So this is current period costs that were completed and transferred. So this adds up to our completed and transferred, which would be 3580669. And now, so that's our finished goods. And now we have to add our closing work in process. So closing work in process, and again we do it separately for material and conversion costs. So for material we have equivalent units of 40,000 completed units, and remember it's equivalent of 40,000 completed, because, and we use the full 40,000 of closing work in process because all the materials were added at the start, so it's 100% of the units were completed for material, and the cost of a completed unit for material is 310, so that's 124,000. And then for closing work in process conversion costs, it's only 30% completed, so that equates to 12,000 full units or equivalent full units. So times the rate of 419, and that gives us 5331. So our closing work in process would be 174331, and we can add this just to check whether we've allocated all our costs, and this needs to correspond to the total of all the costs that were given. Remember, if you look at our T account, these costs, the opening work in process and the current period costs, were given in the scenario. That was our inputs, and that needs to balance with our outputs, our finished goods and our closing work in process. So you can check yourself by adding closing the completed and the closing work in process, add it up and see whether this adds up to our input cost that was given in the scenario. That would also be all of these costs, the 3.755. So that's the first in, first out method. Very important, remember to include opening work in process, just a given amount, because it hasn't been included in the cost per unit calculation. Then we allocate our cost per units to the equivalent units that were completed and transferred, and then we do separately the closing work in process. Again, the equivalent units times the cost per unit of an equivalent unit.